Hello, and thank you for joining us after a week off. I am here with Lynn Crofts. Thank you so much for coming in and explaining the week in bad law to us. So I will just allow you to law explain some stuff that's going on. I guess starting with you'd written about the Rittenhouse, the Cal Rittenhouse case. So
Yeah, and that's actually that trial's taking place not too far from me. I'm in Milwaukee, and that trial's in Kenosha. And Judge Schroeder, it seems like, or Schrader, not sure which way he pronounces it, but it seems like he's really doing his very best to get an acquittal for Kyle Rittenhouse.
mhm.
Um, from banning the phrase alleged victim, which I've never heard of. I've heard of banning the word victim
Mhm.
for people affected by a defendant's conduct, in this case, killed by the defendant. I can understand banning the word victim from a trial, but the phrase alleged victim, I've never heard of that being excluded from a trial. So that's pretty wild. And, of course, the prosecution doesn't get to appeal if there's an acquittal. So if there's an acquittal,
Yeah.
this is it.
That's it. Thank you. I'd seen that. I'd written about this, and someone had commented upon that of like you get to, and I was well, they can appeal it, and I was like, well, I only have a degree in law and order, but even from watching that show, all those TNT marathons, I got the sense of the acquittal is that's it. He gets to walk. He seems to be getting a lot of as if the 17-year-old who literally was committing a crime by being in possession of the gun, they're treating him as if you're trying to convict a cop, because obviously with a cop there's such a high threshold. We as the state empower the police officer to enforce the law, so the cop has to be there at when there's a riot going on. The A 17-year-old can be at home and should be at home and not with a gun. And you shouldn't take a uniformed police officer's gun. That is a very bad thing. And you should be, they would have the right to use lethal force in that regard. But for the defense to say, oh, the victim was reaching, or the rioter was reaching for the gun that he just seen this person use to kill someone, and that would then justify self-defense, to me seems just absurd. That's an absurd argument.
Yeah, it's crazy that this case is being addressed from that angle at all, because it's very much not a thing. This is not a police officer. This is a criminal. A kid who is in illegal possession of a firearm, who traveled to a different state to be a vigilante by his own admission. But for some reason, it's not for some reason, but he's being treated as if, he's, the good guy with the gun, as if he was deputized law enforcement and not just a vigilante.
Yes. And they would have the right, like, oh, he's using the skateboard to decapitate him. And, again, I got, it's very interesting. So, Jamie, I got the sense of, oh, why are you beating up on this? The defense should have the right zealously defend someone, or their client. And I was like, well, there are certainly, to me, and obviously you would know this better, but there are essentially moral stand. Like you go to a certain point, we understand that a zealous defense of your rapist client does not include smearing a woman as wanting it or a slut or bringing in that type of stuff, which again in the bad old days in certain cases still happens, but we don't say, oh, that great defense attorney is doing everything he can to, like, there's certain cases of where this is just low. In certain cases it seems that the defense is moving in that direction of just things that are kind of like, oh, come on, like that's not respectable. Or
Yeah, and some of this stuff, said to the press too, which is, outside of, the actual duty within a courtroom, but still is something you might do for a client. But that has gone some gross kind of racist, weird places as well in a way that it didn't need to represent his client. And yeah, the using the skateboard as a decapitation tool was really fascinating to me.
It just means like how like I literally have a skateboard, and I mentioned this and I said that infuriated me, and people are like, why are you so infuriated by someone using that argument? I said it infuriates me because the whole reason the Second Amendment exists is that the skateboard ain't good. We need guns, right? Like if so every time these vigilantes get on trial, and it's like when Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman's like, the defense attorney is like, well, he wasn't unarmed. He was armed with concrete because he was hitting him against the sidewalk. And it's like, okay, well, then can I get rid of the Second Amendment? Because concrete is plentiful and sidewalks are everywhere. And like, we are all equally armed then? Oh, no. We are saying, obviously, that guns are much more efficient at killing people, much more dangerous. So once you've actually fired and killed someone, I feel like, okay, well, I'm sorry, this is going to be on you to a certain degree. You can't go and say, oh, Jamie and Stephen were unarmed, but she had like that thing in her hair and she might have taken his eye out and he might have known Kung Fu. Who knows? He saw The Matrix once. Like you can't just sort of just, yeah, exactly. He's got glasses. It's like, yeah, you can't just make, it's like, this is a gun. So that to me is like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
People brought up the idea of, and this one, we've discussed this offline of, oh, well, wouldn't you want the same treatment Rittenhouse is receiving? Wouldn't you want that if you were Black? And my response, by person, is just, I just want to survive the encounter with the police. Like, that's usually wonderful. If actually, as you've said, and I agree, a Black kid in that situation would have been summarily executed. He's got a gun, and the cops would see him as a gun. The fact that he was, forget the people he killed trying to remove him, the police actually apprehended him without him being shot dead in those circumstances is laughable. And that's, to me, is like, okay, yeah, he already won in that score, and he got bail, right. And he wasn't coerced into a confession. Like, when you think about the Scottsboro Boys and the Central Park Five, and and I would love you to speak to some of this, of like the history of malfeasance from the police and prosecution. I mean, withholding evidence, all the sort of stuff that have put Black men and women in prison for things they overtly didn't do. Forget like actually did, overtly didn't do. To compare that to the sweetheart fantasy, homicide trial that he's getting, to me is inherently offensive and ahistorical.
Yeah, I mean, there was an entire precinct in Chicago with systematically torturing black men into false confessions into the 90s. Several people brought it up in the courtrooms who had been tortured. And they never even got evidentiary hearings because the judges were kind of like, yeah, clearly we believe the police over you. They didn't torture you. Mm-hmm. And then meanwhile, you've got this white kid from the suburbs who decided to take it upon himself to illegally acquire a weapon, cross state lines in order to be a vigilante, killed 2 people, and is being treated like he's some sort of hero. And like people, when I talk about stuff like this, and I know you've experienced this too, people are always like, well, what are you saying, that Kyle Rittenhouse should have been killed by the police? No, of course that's not what we're saying. But like, can you please look at the difference in these 2 worlds that exist in the American criminal law system?
Yeah. Well, and that's key to me, because one big issue that comes up when, the horrible defund term or even just something as mild as police reform is the idea that inherently, because this comes up a lot, if the outcomes, like if you point to Tamir Rice to George Floyd, the police's response is not sort of, oh yeah, that's terrible. We definitely zero tolerance for that. It's normally, if we can't do this, you white people are going to be inherently unsafe. There's no way we can protect the nation. We got to break a few eggs. Law enforcement's a very racist omelet, and but as you say, that's important to compare because you get to see the outside of the vacuum. It's like, well, you were able to bring this kid in without killing him. You were able to bring in Dylan Roof, who killed Black people in South Carolina, without killing him. What inherently, and what's interesting is that will come up, and someone had responded to me on Twitter about this, where, oh, well, Rittenhouse he wasn't like Tamir Rice was acting weird, which inherently is racial bias, the idea of you can see this Rittenhouse kid and not see him as a threat, even though he's holding the gun, and his movements, which were terrified by his own admission, can be perceived as not as dangerous, whereas a Black kid having the same human reactions of fear or reaction to like a cop stopping them, or movement, like, oh, I'm just gonna I'll show my ID, and to get shot. And so all of that is, as you said, just clearly evidence of the systemic bias, which is what we're trying to call out when we talk about the differential treatment with Rittenhouse and others.
Exactly. Like when you talk about, in a similar vein, when you talk about, had people participating in a BLM protest marched on the Capitol the way that the insurrectionists did, they would have been mowed down by police officers shooting at them. Like that's a fact. Does that mean that we're saying that the police should have shot every single person at the Capitol? No. But like that is reality.
Have you seen 4 Hours at the Capitol? It's an HBO documentary. I reviewed it for the AV Club recently, and it is the footage, and I think a lot of the footage is out there, but some of this footage I've never seen is just, you're seeing the cops having to reason with people. And it sounds crazy, but they're literally, in a way, and it's because, of course, they're outnumbered, right? Like, and in certain ways, they were sort of set up to be outnumbered. They weren't able to, but, literally asking, oh, come on, you're in the Senate, don't sit there. This is really sacred, in ways of where, like, Black protesters being near a police would have been shot because they had the weapon, they had the guns and the weapons. So part of that is just how you prepare the police. Certainly, they were in a position where they couldn't mow them down because the mob would then turn on them. Whereas, I think it was Lindsey Graham who said, you've got the gun, shoot them, like mow them down. And I think, well, no, that this is a violent mob. But yes, I mean, the very different to where, and I, what is the other response but racism, really, when you look at the idea that the former president, of course, Donald Trump, can rally behind this woman who was breaking, in the way I put it, I think from where Ashley Babbitt was, it wasn't so much like someone breaking into the front door and getting shot. It's like she's in your bedroom door.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, if someone's banging on your bedroom door, okay, like that's even more escalation. So she's getting, and the cop has warned her and she gets shot. And he's like, this should never happen, as if he was always ACLU president before
right.
all of this, like bleeding heart. He was talking about shooting protesters in the legs and whatever. So this is overtly racist. And how did we lose that messaging battle? How can Democrats are they just too timid to come out and just say, look at how he's talking about this, based on everything else, we have a systemic problem?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's how I talk about sometimes, like, it's hard to sometimes believe that, like, the last, 5 years have happened, because like all of the bad stuff that we're used to happening in the shadows, like, was happening way out in the open with Donald Trump. And then even when he, like, the Blue Lives Matter guy goes full insurrectionist, so, supports this woman who, you know, was participating in the insurrection, trying to get to Congress people, you know, not that far away. You know, how many cops since then have like committed suicide? It's who were there that day. And these are the people who are saying, you know, Blue Lives Matter. We care so much about the lives of police. It's almost like they were just being racist all along.
Oh, exactly. And I you know, I hinted at this in the article I wrote, but I, you know, I would imagine, I can't say that this is the reason for suicides. I'm not saying that, but I would imagine it's quite overwhelming to realize that it's all bullshit, because it's different where if you're a cop, if you're in that system, you think you and me, we're all just we're the liberals who don't get it. I'm the Black Lives Matter rioter. I'm whatever. But Trump was your man and your family member. So like they can turn us off, but they go home. You know, cops, they live often in the suburbs, in cop communities, around cop people, and they are used to everyone being like, everything you did is right. That was terrible. What happened to that cop in the Derek Chauvin, you know, in that case, in this case, here's a case of where they're like, oh, well, maybe she shouldn't have died. And maybe that cop deserved this. And whatever Trump said was right. I feel like that is such an emotional shock to the system. It must be overwhelming. It's like, and I think that's in many cases what occurred, you know, to getting back to what you were saying, with your Romneys and even your Lindsey Grahams pre-Trump, there was this sort of plausible deniability, because generally you'd have a Romney who would come out, or George Bush, and it's just kind of like, yeah, whatever the cops do in those neighborhoods is fine. Tough on crime, tough on crime, tough on crime. Democrats like Bill Clinton would be the same way. Tough on crime, tough on crime. And of course, you know, the white guy who steals, you know, everyone's life savings in a pyramid scheme, who does all of that, you know, that somehow is less worthy of death than someone knocking over a liquor store. But those are kind of almost academic debates, because they're less, you know, the white collar crime had been shifted into a different way, right? So when Republicans are kind of like, yeah, those guys can get off, and no, and even when, you know, Trump's cronies like Roger Stone was like, oh my God, how dare they arrest Roger Stone in so early in the morning, because you shouldn't wake up the guy.
Right.
Rude. Like, at least wake him up. He was in his pajamas. You need to at least let him get dressed, have a cup of coffee and whatever.
Yeah.
So
let's ask Breonna Taylor how she feels about that.
Exactly. Like, yeah. And that was the sort of thing. It's like the same time as Breonna Taylor's like, well, they just cops like breast you know, understand how cops work, right? That was like a central. But I think it's been such relief where you literally, after the summer of the protests and then Trump's reaction, the Republican reaction, the cop reaction, and then just literally, and again, to me, Democrats losing this clear argument where you have people defending. I mean, I think overall, January 6th, the insurrection has been defended by Republicans, have no shame in saying they're upset. And how many of them were actually the mob? That's actually only a small percentage. And like this footage, and we don't have a propaganda outlet, but this footage is like, you know, there's cops being almost lynched, like beaten. It's like something from Suddenly Last Summer, where they eat the guy on the beach or whatever. It's like horrible. And then just, you know, the lady who works for Nancy Pelosi, one of these aides or whatever, these are women, and of course they're women of color, so we care a little bit less about them, right? But these are women hiding, fearing for their lives, and they're going to be killed, raped, and it is so different from what they call the white backlash, like, you know, the white mothers upset at school board meetings. But these young women, these white women of color who are afraid of being killed, who cares, right? Like that it is not, it is, I don't know, it's just horrifying.
Yeah. You know, if that crowd had been able to get a hold of like AOC or Ilhan Omar or something, I mean.
Yeah. Well, and you know, Tucker Carlson's made fun of it. Nancy Mace mocked it for that AOC should fear for her life. But the footage of what they did, these are to a cop. I presume that they like their boys in blue better than AOC. And literally, these are people who were almost lynched. Like Officer Fanon was like, he was barely there. He was close to death, had a heart attack. Like, they would have killed these people. And it has mostly sort of vanished. Could I, I'd like to ask you about the kind of the rulings that came out in Georgia for the Ahmaud Arbery case, excuse me. Specifically, the process to how they got only one Black person on the jury in a town where it's like 24% Black. It was an interesting jury selection process, being like what would determine why they would remove you, specifically related to the Confederate flag.
Yeah. So, and so it was, if a juror said correct me if I'm wrong, if a juror said they thought the Confederate flag was racist or potential juror, they were struck, right?
Yeah.
That is crazy. I mean, I get it. Like, I get it. That's when we're like, I will give it to the defense lawyers that, like, that was a good move to try to get that on there, until you get to the fact that the judge actually said that he saw intentional bias in the jury selection.
But what could you do?
It is allowing it to continue. No, like, no, you start over. That's not how that goes. Like, they don't get to discriminate on the basis of race just because they're the defense lawyers and not the prosecution.
They missed the exit. We just got to keep going on this trial. We can't go back. We missed that exit. We just got to keep going to Acquittalville. What's interesting is, from a legal standpoint, though, was it that flag that the killer had was removed? Almost, the state had to sort of kind of affirmatively stated that this is an offensive, polarizing flag. So it's not kind of out of nowhere. It's not like, oh, we're saying if you believe someone voted for Trump, they're racist. That is kind of taking steps that, okay, that's a very specific opinion and whatever. But this is like, I feel like the state has kind of sort of said the treason flag and here's this history and whatever, and we are affirmatively making this choice. And they say the same way in Mississippi. So that just seems odd to me because it's not some random decision, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's these two cases, or, these two trials happening at the same time is kind of perfect because, it's two live examples of the different criminal justice system that we have when, random white dude kills, a Black person or someone who's protesting for Black lives. It's just an entirely different world. It's an entirely different world.
But we only got here because of that, those protests, because of Black Lives Matter. They had tried to sweep this under the rug. That, that to me it's important because you and I again talked about this offline. There's a resistance, I would say, not just in conservative circles, but like in white liberal circles. So white men have real trouble speaking the term systemic racism, acknowledging it. It's very difficult for them. They want everything is sort of an individual is racist, okay, but not a system. And so with Ahmaud Arbery, this wasn't a case of where these are just some two random white dudes who killed this guy. Immediately, the good cops came in and arrested. Oh my goodness, you shot this man, and now there's a trial. It was like all the way up to, the prosecutor, the first prosecutor, had tried to cover it up. The police cover it up, and it could have just really been buried. But Black people, we have to have on retainer Benjamin Crump. Got to call up Al Sharpton. We got to go. We got to make way. We've got to fight to make the system almost work in a sense of justice for us. Like all of these cases.
Oh yeah,
it's easier just to grieve, right? Like not to have to fight to justice.
Well, and everything is exhausting, and everything is exhausting for me. I can't even imagine how exhausting everything is for you. But no, it's true, and that that trial would never have happened if it kind of hadn't been the perfect storm of a protest movement, and that was so big that the press actually had to cover it, because it just would have sat there forever. I mean, cases like this happen all the time and are never gone back to. It's a good old boys network, and it's like that the former prosecutor in North Carolina who was recently arrested and has been involved in like a bunch of mysterious deaths, and like he was the only prosecutor for several counties for a long time, and his family has always been the prosecutors. And it's like, this is still real in America in 2021.
Yeah, Breonna Taylor, and only really the most minor justice there, some people getting arrested, but again, that came out of the George Floyd protests. Then the Elijah McClain in Colorado, where again cops covered it up in the most sociopathic manner possible. Another investigation, and just essentially killed this kid. And this is like a systemic problem with the police, and we've gotten nowhere. Like the protests were enough to get those individual issues, but any sort of systemic problem, we've gotten nowhere as far as police reform or whatever. And I know there's a tendency from moderates to want to blame activists for this. Like, if activists didn't exist, if you didn't protest, if you didn't talk about defund, which is a sort of, for my own experience, my own history, a very perverse victim blaming, because as someone of my advanced years, I remember ACT UP, I remember everything. I remember these people. If only those activists, we could get some work done. And it's like, well, I think, it's not like moderates working this line and getting us to marriage equality. I think the activists were making it an issue that could not be ignored. But that's sort of the tension, I think, within the Democratic Party, the sense of activists are an embarrassment. They chase away the white ladies, and we lose, and then that makes it impossible to do the good things for you that we would do if they didn't offend the nice white ladies. And so that's sort of that tension, right?
Yeah, and it's all infuriating, and it's all, just kind of a willingness for people who care about things like systemic racism. Democrats would rather that, they just kind of talk about it in the background, because, Karen in the suburbs, it makes her uncomfortable to talk about. She's not sure how she feels about this whole critical race theory thing. And I absolutely think that the elections on Tuesday were fueled by racist backlash. And with, you bring up the critical race theory and whatnot, and it's crazy to me that we are even acting like the Republicans are acting in good faith when they talk about things like critical race theory, because they're not. And they're not even talking about critical race theory. If you look at these bills, they're not about critical race theory. They're about acknowledging the real history and current present of our country. It's about, not teaching about, real, like, I mean, how many of these bills would limit what you could talk about like the period of Reconstruction or the civil rights movement? In Virginia, they want to ban Toni Morrison, and somehow we're acting as if this is like a legitimate thing for parents to be concerned about.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a sense of what is history. Okay. So part of how is the stories and where you center the stories. So my wife and I were watching Finding Your Roots, the Gates show. And often, in a former world, what happens is it'd be like, oh, Jamie, here's your relatives, and here's, your great great grandmother was the first lady to open a law firm in West Virginia, you know, something like that. Oh, that's wonderful. She's nice. And of course, go her. And you don't talk about that she, you know, owned slaves or attended live lynchings or whatever, right? You don't talk about that. And that was the inherent, now obviously even going back to slavery, the inherent, that itself is propaganda. That was, you know, American history was taught through propaganda to think of where I'm, you know, a kid sitting there and it's like, oh, gee, my people didn't really do much of anything to make this country. You know, white people did all the awesome stuff. And then, you know, maybe I might do something decent, but doesn't seem, the odds don't seem great because I'm not writing Declaration of Independence. I was, you know, they don't really talk about what I did. And, but what Gates will do, well, he will have, you know, you as a celebrity, but he would have the black celebrity comes in and like, that's their history of like, oh, your great great grandmother, and here's her slave journal, and here's the hell she endured, you know, living under this white person. And that's a totally different story. So all these stories about who you center. And so to me, it was very fascinating where even again, white liberals were shocked that Texas law could even look at trying to find both sides of the Holocaust, because they're living in a world where, of course, that's objectively, how could you even, it's a deranged concept to ever think that, well, no, it's how you tell the story. You know, if you had a Gone with the Wind version in Nazi Germany with, you know, a Nazi Rhett Butler and a Nazi Scarlett O'Hara and a wisecracking Jewish maid, and basically you feel bad about, oh, gee, oh, I hope the nice Nazi lady doesn't lose her home, and those terrible allies are coming and taking everything she built, and it's terrible, but tomorrow's another day, and you're centering on them. And Anne Frank is not a key story. Like, how many Anne Frank stories we know, because that's the Underground Railroad, right? Like being hidden or whatever. How many of those stories we know very few of, because Anne Frank, that, oh my God, this poor girl and whatever. I remember empathizing with her because she's a human being. You're reading her story. We don't think about all those people who didn't make it Underground Railroad, much like her, who was sold out by other people or whatever, because that is a horrible thing. No one wants to tell that story. And you were talking about the Karens. I think, you know, it's narcissistic injury, right? Like the worst thing, if you've ever dealt with a narcissist, if you make them feel bad, it's almost, it's, if they were completely sociopathic, it'd be different, right? But there's enough of a soul there that they feel injured, they feel bad, they know they feel bad, and but instead of like confronting that, they're like, okay, it's your fault for making me feel bad. I'm angry because you've done this to me. You've made me confront this. And so I think that's what we're seeing.
Exactly. And, you know, I grew up in the very white small town Midwest, and I know these people. I grew up with these people. And, you know, they think that being called a racist is worse than being racist.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't necessarily realize that they think that. But, like, they think calling, you know, someone a racist is just the worst thing that you can possibly do. And so by making, you know, people confront how they feel, or anything, you know, that could make them be introspective about themselves, it's just absolutely not.
And, you know, we were talking about this earlier before we went live. The response, Democrats are doing two things that seem to be really bugging me. I know I bang on Democrats a lot, but this is important. One is to refuse to define wokeness. So this is, conservatives have co-opted in a very kind of racist way this term woke, because it originally had originated in the African American community about becoming aware of the world or whatever. Kind of like how misogynists co-opted red pill and blue, terminology from trans women, which I still, again, find repulsive that they did this. And whenever, so today on CNN interviews, Dana Bash had asked Mark Warner, it's like, well, is the Democratic Party too woke? And then he just sort of addresses that question of like, of course we're, you know, but instead of, well, what do you mean by woke? Which is something very good white allies I know are very good at doing that. So like when someone basically forcing someone to abandon the code, right? So it's like, Jamie, I don't kind of want to go to that neighborhood tonight. Like, why? What do you mean? Oh, it's not the best neighborhood. What do you mean by that? Like, what do you kind of making you just come out and say it? Like, why don't you want to go to this bar? What do you mean? Like, oh, it's kind of a really dangerous bar. What do you mean? Like, why? It's not. It's right next door to this other bar we were at. Like, okay, black people go there. Like, shaking, forcing them to say it. And so Democrats are trying to kind of, what do you mean by woke? Define what woke is. And what's worse is that the response to that was then like, okay, well, as you were saying, right? Like Democrats are something, Republicans are being good actors about this, right? So they're just concerned about critical race theory. Maybe it's just if we reassure them that we're not teaching kids critical race theory, which to me is mind-bogglingly stupid because that allows Democrats are sort of lying down and letting Republicans smear and define critical race theory like a legitimate academic theory and as like next of kin to Satan. And, well, if I was like, if I learned that my teachers went to Nazi Academy, I probably wouldn't want them teaching my kids. It's not to me necessarily encouraging if a Democrat were to say, oh, don't worry, no one's teaching how to be a good Nazi at the schools, but the teachers have been influenced and informed and trained at how to be a good Nazi academy. Huh? Well, wait a minute. And similar to our, liberal in the judicial forums. So while we've kind of laid down and died and let the very extreme Federalist Society, Republicans pick justices from a Federal Society sharper image catalog, and that's okay. And we don't necessarily go on that. The critical every potential liberal justice or judge who's been through critical race theory will get slapped down with that, especially once Republicans take the Senate. That will be the pretense to me. There'll be pretense to not even give. It's like, oh, Jamie, well, we're not even going to give you a hearing because, she took a class in critical race theory. It's going to be the new McCarthyism. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. It's just, Republicans are just so much better at doing this kind of thing than Democrats are, right? Like Democrats would never even try to say, like, we're not going to hold a vote on any judge who's a member of the Federalist Society. Mm-hmm. Like, they wouldn't even try that. But if you think Mitch McConnell is ever going to allow a full vote on a Black judicial nominee who took a critical race theory class in college or law school, it's not going to happen.
Well, and it becomes the flip side in a weird way of what you're saying with the Confederate flag. So, the white, they're doing a good job at cutting off the idea of associating the Confederate flag, having that on your bumper sticker with being a racist. But we will now associate, even reading the 1619 Project eventually to being a racist, to being anti-American, and to hold you back. And again, you and I probably know some of the extremes of the Federalist Society and how but Democrats have a terrible job to me of painting that to the individual people. They just see these people like it's part of the mainstream. Oh yeah, they're all members of the Federalist Society. That's Federalist Papers. I liked Hamilton, that type of thing, instead of like really digging into the extremes of that. And so, yeah, I mean, this is why are we running away from that critical race theory battle? We need to defend that. But no, I mean, that goes back to the woke thing, right? Like no one wants to defend wokeness. And to me, that's also annoying because I'm not a fan of James Carville. But his whole thing of we're too woke, that's everything is like too woke, too woke, too woke. But I recall James Carville, saying the worst thing that could happen was for Democrats to nominate Bernie Sanders in 2020. Now, the people who ran what I would consider woke campaigns was Hillary Clinton in 2016. And even now, Hillary Clinton supporters, Kamala Harris supporters, and I, with, and I respect that opinion, have called out Sanders, and to a degree Elizabeth Warren, for lack of intersectionality, not being what I would say woke, to prioritizing, an economic agenda and trying to reach white working class over, what again would be painted as wokeness. So what is it, right? And then, I mean, Biden literally ran in 2020 on a woke platform over based on Charlottesville. Like,
yep,
racism is bad. I don't care how good the economy's going, because it was the time. The economy's going great, but Trump is a racist. That to me is a woke campaign. Whereas
he said during the Democratic debates that he wanted to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Woke identity politics.
Exactly. Like, and so to me, it's like, okay, who is the ideal? And I've beaten this before. I was not a Sanders supporter, but I feel like because of whatever issues there had been, and it was a very contentious primary, the areas where it seems like the Democrats will then say, we need someone who, and they will describe essentially Bernie Sanders, but it can't be Bernie Sanders because they don't like Bernie Sanders. So then it has to be, okay, we need someone who can appeal to the white working class, especially men. We're losing a non-college educated white men. We're
never going to win them.
Yes, we're not going to win them at all. But, remember when Joe Rogan said, I like Bernie, I don't like these other guys. And I feel like people rightly called out, well, Joe Rogan's a jerk. Joe Rogan, who had Bernie Sanders on his show, would not have Pete Buttigieg, would not have Joe Biden, would not have Kamala, like people, and they'd ask, because I just only talk to my friends who happen to be white dudes. But, what I would like to hear from Carville is like, well, what is this tint? Where is the right moment? Where is it? Are we shooting for Rogan, or are we kind of backing up, defending trans people? I mean, I've seen the worst stuff after Tuesday's election losses. Like someone saying, because everyone loves the sister soldier thing, right? They think that was magic. They think 30 years ago, having the ritual slapping around of a Black woman is a key to electoral success. And that isn't actually it. I mean, I think that might have made some people, the reinforcement of racial hierarchy might have helped, but ultimately it was that Bill Clinton was a very good politician. I think a bad politician beating up on Black women, you shouldn't do that anyway, but I don't think that's a great idea. But, well, you need to come out, reject wokeness, reject using pronouns. It's like, okay, well, school, I mean, that's just like basic human decency. Like, how is that? That's just like, we should just be an asshole. And someone who's authentically an asshole is going to always defeat someone. You can't out asshole someone.
Right. Well, and it's like, how are I supposed to forget the fact that like MLK said, beware the white moderate.
Oh yeah, it was like detailed right here. It's like, I respect your cause, but not the way you're going about it. Which again,
exactly, as if that
will literally say that.
Using that argument for every social movement ever
since.
It's all coded language. It's all coded language. It's too woke. You're saying that we care too much about Black people now. It's the same people. We need to be careful when we talk about things like abortion. It's the same thing where we're just like, you know what?
Well, yes, we can't affirmatively believe in anything because we will lose, which is just, like, as I say, like Abigail Spanberger's "please don't hurt me" positions of like, we didn't elect anyone to be FDR, and I've been told that FDR was racist and he put Japanese people away, and it's like, well, that's not what Spanberger meant, because definitely I did not elect Biden to
intern Japanese people.
That was not, in fact, that was part of, I distinctly said, no. Would you like Joe Biden to? I was like, no, I don't think so. I checked that off.
Yeah.
No, it was more of like being bold and ambitious is what she meant. Like that, we just want a place warmer, which, the soon to be former Representative Spanberger, because she won't survive 2022, what I would ask is who benefits from the placeholder administration, because Republicans want time to give you your Glenn Youngkins to get their act, get in order, get prepared, and that's what's been happening. You know, Democrats tried again. I got beat up on this before online when I said, "Why is Nancy Pelosi and others saying we need, why can't we need a good Republican Party, Jamie? We need a good Republican Party because we, as if we don't have enough issues with Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, but we need a good Republican Party, a strong Republican Party that's not Trump." And
Right.
hey,
Yeah.
we got that, and we got our butts kicked in Virginia, and we almost lost in New Jersey. So that's what a good party looks like. A good party wins, and and it's not like we have an anti-Trump. Like McAuliffe did not run an anti. He had no idea how to run against an anti-Trump Republican who was willing to kind of fake the Trump funk elsewhere. I mean, that what's scary about that was he got Trump level rural turnout while getting the white ladies in the suburbs. And that's game over for us because, and I think you and I both sounded alarms about the shakiness of the Biden coalition, because it was sort of like, okay, well, we've got the never Trumpers, and moderates love the never Trumpers. They love that Rick Wilson. They love that, they love Amanda Carpenter. They love Bill Kristol, and they retweet those guys. They love them. They're better than the squad. They're not embarrassing like the squad. We love those never Trumpers. They're so cool. And it's like, well, those guys are gone. I know you think David Hogg is annoying. I know you think all these people are annoying, these liberals who say the wrong things and are impolite, but you have potential to, those are long-term Democrats, potentially. These aren't. These are people who specifically, I don't know how many times I have to tell you, we don't like Trump for good. And I respect that, right? I respect the point of Liz Cheney, unlike Elise Stefanik and others, saying, look, I draw the line at coups, but they're not going to help Biden win re-election or Kamala.
Right. Yeah. It's all bad.
No, I don't mean it to be. Oh, I do. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's hope. I just think that we need to take that lesson of, we have a shaky coalition. We can't really rely on the suburb. And I mean, this goes back to 2016 when Chuck Schumer, who in his history of always being right, had said that, okay, well, even if we're losing those Clinton Democrats in the rural areas, we're going to get two more, in the suburbs. We're going to win in the suburbs, and we'll have, in the DNC invited Mike Bloomberg to talk about how he's a good billionaire. That's going to help us win, and it didn't. That's the problem. But I do think there's potential. It's interesting. I've seen online some folks say, well, young people suck, which is a great thing for Democrats to say, but young people suck. They don't come out, and we need to focus on people over 45. And okay, well, I'm over 45. And even though it's hard to believe, Jamie, I was young once. I was not born 45. Now, my wife might say I might have been. Some of my, preferences for musical theater and all of that sort of, but I was not born 45. And so, the first person I voted for was Bill Clinton. I felt excited. I felt all the stuff that these young people, I felt like, well, we can change the world. We can do new things. And I feel like there was probably the same when you were there for Obama and others. And I feel like that is, you get young people, and they're the ones who will, if we get those young voters, then they will be there at 45. If we just think you can't, to me, it's like marketing, right? You can't get the 40. If you're just trying to get 45-year-olds now, you've lost. I need to get,
exactly,
ward off the Karens.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I actually like don't get me started because like I can even go into my like I think the voting age should be lowered. I think that we should have automatic voter registration at
Mhm.
16, so when kids are getting their driver's license, and I think 16-year-olds should be able to vote. Anyway, this is all aside, but it's true that when you can get those young voters, they keep voting. And so many campaigns and activists and the people who are super involved in the way that you want them to be involved, even all of them will say, oh, but young people don't vote, as if we should just accept that as fact and not try to win them. And these same people who will tout that Trump was an economic populist, even though he wasn't in any way. He's just tapping into the racism of working class white people. Sorry, I lost the thread there. ADD moment.
Well, just if I can add to your point, though, I think Democrats are very afraid of passion, even though passion won them in 92 and then passion won them in 2008. They want to find, well, maybe it wasn't just hope and change that won. Maybe it wasn't just don't stop believing. There had to be something clear, because it can't just be passion. And I feel, to me, the biggest fail of liberal history recently was that Democrats were annoyed by Occupy Wall Street. They're like, okay, well, I know you're upset about what happened, but is there like a give me a 10-point PowerPoint slide or whatever of what's happening? And then who co-opted that and rode that anger to the White House? Donald fucking Trump. Like, how embarrassed. It was like, it was one thing, it was some like bartender, even Boehner, fine. Boehner was a bartender. He feels like a working jail. Donald Trump was able to take that and run with it and run up margins in the rural areas, whatever. And I agree with people who say, like, let's not dismiss it as racism. Let's say he is speaking to their concerns, their racist concerns, but other people have equal concerns. They will listen. They will feel like, I feel your pain, like maybe
Yeah.
another Democrat who won an election or two. I feel your pain. I feel what is happening to you and why. And again, over the past year, the anger that we're only being able to hear and it's only being heard is coming from the right. And the left is not, as if no one is really angry about January 6th, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are not finding a way to leverage that. Instead, it's always about the anti-cancel culture, what's going on in the schools and what's whatever. And, you know, even as awful as those obviously voter suppression laws are and electoral, which sad to say might not even be necessary at the rate things are going. They might not need to rig elections in 2022 or 2024. They could win it outright. But what is, compelling there is, yes, you believe a lie. You believe Trump won. It's a lie. But and Josh Hawley said this, others have said it. I don't care I can't tell my constituents they are wrong. I am going to do whatever it takes to support their mistaken belief. Now, Jamie, is that anything that Black people have heard from Democrats who are usually too busy with their head up cops' ass when we're saying, oh my God, like, like we're in the streets because life is, we can't go on like this. I don't want to be a mural. That's what I like to say. It's like, I know what the pattern is. There's a hashtag, then there's a mural downtown that some nice talented white people make. That's great. I don't want the Stephen Robinson hashtag and the mural because I'm not that photogenic. I don't want a mural. That'd be very bad for the downtown area to have my face like this. But that is what the pattern is. Show me the police reform laws. Show me the voting. You won't nuke the filibuster to fight these voting rights, these voter suppression bills to give us voting rights, but Republicans will shred the Constitution for it, and people get that. People get that. So when Marjorie Taylor Greene is president or is winning, it's because it's like, I'm one of you. I speak to you, and I feel like that is something that's lacking. Like, people just don't want to do that. So the reaction is how I can kind of appeal to the Karens, as you said, or the folks in Reddit who are upset I can't dare call them racist, even though they want to ban, books about slavery or books about what. And again, it is, how do you talk about these things, right? Because imagine yourself as 5 or 6 year old Jamie. Like, okay, Rosa Parks, I'm studying Rosa Parks. Okay, well, wait a minute.
Let's pause for a moment to think about this from the perspective of the nice bus driver.
Yes, let's have the bus drive. Well, like as a kid, wouldn't you be so like if you live in this bubble of not like kids have a sense of right or wrong. Like it just seems like, well, that's a horrible person, right? Like, why would you do that to that like it fundamentally is such an awful thing, right? Like, well, wait a minute. And like they arrest her for that. So it was a crime. No one on the bus did anything. None of the white people stood up. Like, and that's, what happened to Rosa Parks also is so clearly, again, Emmett Till could be taught in a concept of non-systemic racism if you get away from the trial, of course, where the guys walked, but sense of some racist white guys killed this person. That's bad. But America's not systemically racist. But no, America had a law that you could take someone's seat. Like it's an inherently so horrific, like something of where an evil alien race would do on Star Trek. So how do you, of course, a kid's going to hear that and feel a sense of collective shame, maybe, that this was law of the land and that this was something that people who looked like him or his descendants did. Like, and so how do you teach that? How do you teach that this was, and to say that's a brave thing, you have to then say that someone would have nearly tried to kill her for doing it. So yeah, like they don't want, well, let's speak from the perspective of the bus driver. He was just following orders. There's been no sort of, that's a well-respected defense.
Yeah. And like it's interesting if you kind of compare what Germany did like as a country with its institutions after World War II versus what the United States did after the Civil War. Because, Germany entirely rewrote its constitution entirely. And it's a really interesting, progressive constitution. They have, enacted all kinds of, the Constitution was written specifically to prevent something like the Holocaust from ever happening again. And, acknowledging the horrors that happened. And we never did that. Mm-hmm. We never did that. We passed a couple new constitutional amendments and we're like, so everything's fine now, right?
Yeah. And we don't study the history. So you can even go back to where, if you look at Emancipation Proclamation to later the fall of Reconstruction and the Great Migration, where literally Black people were sent as refugees out because it was so horrific. To that point, it's a similar period of time from the passage of the Civil Rights Act to now. And you can see similar of like, oh, well, after slavery ended, we had some Black senators, we had some Black stuff, things are going great. And then, oh, things are terrible. And similar to like, oh,
yeah.
Well, obviously things can't go wrong because Obama was president. It's like, well, no, if you look at history, if you look at what's happening and trying to create a white minority, like it has happened.
And it's the same kind of racist reactionary politics that happened at the time too, because, the rich white men in power are terrified of what would happen if the working class actually banded together as a working class. Mm-hmm. And so they are more than happy to flame racism and, fear of the other to make sure that, Black working class and white working class remain separate from each other.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's sad. I mean, as someone, I'm sure you've studied like the Marxist theory behind that of like, working class people of different countries should not be fighting for the wealth. Why are we doing this? Let's band together. Unfortunately, it just seems like too often the reverse happens. Yeah. You're more likely to get a white nationalism, which is my identity as a poor white person is with this rich white person more so than my neighbor who's Black.
Right. Like how many how many people would vote for like a fully socialist government if it only benefited other white people?
Oh yeah. Well, I think there's I think they hit on Sanders. I mean, the perception that Sanders would, and again, these were never Trumpers who were obviously Democrats. Certainly had every reason to believe that they had no ulterior motives. But like Rick Wilson was saying that Bernie Sanders would lose 49 states and all this sort of stuff. I mean, they did the studies, and Rob and I had talked about where in states like in rural parts of Ohio or whatever, they weren't getting him as scary. They were trying to. Well, he said this about Castro. He did this. And what? Who's a Castro? What are you talking about? Like, I don't. He seems like because he comes across again a degree of because he's a white male, he came across as less scary. And I think they, and part of seizing on wokeness is to associate those policies with blackness, with and especially, and then of course,
I mean, how many diehard Sanders supporters are totally fine with what the New York Democratic Party did in Buffalo?
Oh yeah.
So it was a black woman.
Yeah, like it. Well, I Rob and I again talked about that of how it's really sort of short-sighted. Like everyone's like, okay, well, fine, and you can not like her, you can not this candidate, but if you have told me that Stein supporters were doing the wrong thing, then how can you then say like, okay, well, primaries don't count if the socialist wins, or and so she won the primary, and then they didn't immediately cut off the guy who lost.
Yep.
And certain states have sore loser laws or whatever. But to me, that's sort of okay. Well, eventually, your expectation is that if AOC runs against Schumer, I'm not saying she won't, but if she runs and loses the primary, your expectation is that she's going to immediately endorse, be a good little Democrat, immediately endorse and get her loyal supporters behind Schumer. Because if she didn't, if she were to run third party or even just say because the New York party like really smeared her by not essentially saying we support her, and even also actively comparing her to perhaps Hitler. If that happened, that you could clearly see a Republican potentially beating Schumer if AOC as a sore loser suppresses the vote. And everyone's like, well, that's different. This is that. It's like, okay, well, fine. You're just gonna, if you're saying politics is Calvin ball, what can I say? I feel like that was really disappointing. And it doesn't mean that I thought that she was the best candidate or whatever. It's just like she won the primary and should have had the full support of the party based on.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also just shows, I mean, how different, Bernie Sanders is treated differently because he's a white man. And, try to imagine like any of the women in the squad getting the same coverage or, support. That it's just not, it's never going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that's why Republicans have since 2018 focused on the squad, tried to use terms wokeness, because woke is kind of, again, there's a period where ghetto was something where even the most seemingly liberal, someone who would say, and again, as you were saying, don't like being called a racist. I knew someone who had used it at work, and a black woman complained and was like infuriated. How dare she call me a racist? It was like, but why would you say that restaurant's ghetto or this ghetto? And something she kept saying. She kept like using it as this pejorative.
Yep.
And and
like
thug, yes, and like these coded terms, and when called upon it, like, okay, well, how dare you? Because often self-described liberals who are the worst at that, because it's like, how dare you call me a racist? I am not a racist. I do, I have an Obama t-shirt or something. And so yeah, I mean, associating all that to AOC and the others, and to make that all that's terrible about progressivism, and so all that good.
And how dare these young women of color not know their place?
Yes, and even so, when people, I'm a big fan of Lauren Underwood. I'm a big fan of Sharice Davids. But what I resent is when it's like, hey, you mention them only while pointing out that they're good, the good ones, because as a minority, you've been there. So I don't, and it's the worst feeling because it's kind of like, no, don't bring me into this. I'm not your good one to knock down the bad one. Like, if you want
let's compare
praises,
Get to Leave to Lauren Underwood and talk about which one is the good one.
Yeah, like if you want to sing Lauren Underwood's praises, do so, but don't do so
Great.
only in the
She's my
context.
mom's congresswoman, and
Oh,
y'all should send her money.
Yeah, please do. She's gonna have a very. I think she nearly won last time, and
it's a very red district.
Yeah, it's no. I definitely hope for the best. It seems again like I'm being negative when I say certain people like her, Spanberg, are going to lose their seats, but it's generally if you're in a plus Republican district during what is shaping up to be a wave, there's only so much.
Yeah,
like that is essentially,
especially for people who are elected as part of the Democratic wave.
Yeah, like
in these purple districts or red districts.
It's the purple districts that are going to give Republican. I mean, apparently they're insane. I'd like to ask you about some of the gerrymandering before we go, but they're insane gerrymandering is pretty much giving them the House already on paper. Certain of these states, but I mean, it's ultimately going to be the purple. It's not AOC or Omar. It's going to be the purple districts that fall first to give them. And I think that's the battle we have to fight to make sure that doesn't happen, to hold that line despite a lot of precedent. But yeah, I mean, Wisconsin and Ohio, things are like where Trump either lost, like in Wisconsin, or won by, like, I think North Carolina he won by like a point, but like Republicans are going to get like 78% of the seats.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Oh, and like here in Wisconsin, I mean, I can tell you right now, our lines in Wisconsin are going to be drawn by a court. The question is whether it's the state Supreme Court or the Seventh Circuit. Right now, it's looking like the state Supreme Court, so I'm guessing they're still going to gerrymander in favor of Republicans, but we'll see. Mm-hmm. But no, Wisconsin is a perfect example, though, because in 2018, Democrats got, I believe it was 64% it was 54% of the vote for state assembly, and they got 36% of the seats because of how gerrymandered our assembly districts are. And actually, and so right now we have Governor Evers is a Democrat, but both houses of our legislature are Republican. And the way our state constitution is written, the legislature is supposed to draw the maps, and then the governor is supposed to sign it. Legislature is going to pass the same super gerrymandered maps that, like, they actually passed like a non-binding law saying we're going to try to keep the districts as much as we can like the current districts. And so that they're trying to keep it super gerrymandered in a partisan way, since our federal courts don't hear those cases anymore. And Evers is going to veto it, and it's going to go to the court. But it's a disaster. And like the thing is like I very like strongly on a personal level believe that all mapping should be done by independent, nonpartisan experts. Mm-hmm. I don't think it should have anything to do with politics at all. And like for work, I'm going to be fighting for independent redistricting and stuff, and I'm proud to do that. But like on a personal level, Republicans are really busy doing all they can to dig in and establish and entrench their own power, while Democrats are trying to make things more fair. And in the end,
it's not going to work.
It's not going to end well.
No, that mob family doesn't turn out well. Like, okay, well, we promise not to. We certainly won't show up to this meeting with guns. Okay,
yeah.
All right. So, can you? For people who might not know, like, to what extent was a lot of the partisan gerrymandering potentially something that some of these voting rights laws that got, of course, filibustered were potentially could have addressed? You alluded somewhat to that.
Yeah, and I don't remember the specifics, but there are definitely things that can be done at the federal level, even though elections are run at the state level. Like, for example, the Voting Rights Act. And it's still, in place with regard to creation of majority minority districts and that type of thing. And you could absolutely pass a federal law making it illegal to do partisan gerrymandering. What the Supreme Court said wasn't that there can't be a law like that coming from the federal government. What the Supreme Court said, and I lost my thread again. Give me a second. Supreme Court. Oh, Shelby County Voting Rights Act. Oh, partisan gerrymandering. That's where I was. Sorry, that's how my ADHD brain works. What the Supreme Court said in the partisan gerrymandering case was just that, like, partisan gerrymandering, it's not a constitutional issue, so these cases can't be brought in federal court. That doesn't prohibit Congress from passing a law saying that it's illegal.
Well, wasn't that sort of the weird twist of like, oh, well, that's not racist, it's just anti-democratic, except most Democrats are, minorities. So it's kind of like, in where is that balance? So I guess the sense would be, well,
and I mean, it was certainly to skew things in favor of Republicans. Like, don't get me wrong, but like,
yeah, I mean, if you're a Republican, it's in your best, overtly, if you're a Republican, it's in your best interest for minorities not to vote. That is fundamentally what it is now. And to me, saying like, oh, well, that's just partisan politics, then it was like, okay, well, it's not just a sense of, oh, we want to make sure union households don't vote or suppress the vote in certain union households or suburban areas or whatever. It is so clearly racially because of what it is now. Then it's like, I'm sorry, well, you can't do it on that basis. But I mean, that's been the ongoing struggle or the tension, right? It's like, even getting away with the insurrection or whatever, because what we're seeing is what happens is essentially Republicans have the majority of white voters, and that creates the sense of legitimacy because for them, Obama's not legitimate. And so whenever, and I would bring this up whenever someone would say, well, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and Trump, it's like all that matters. Trump won 60%, almost 60% of the white vote. Sarah Sanders would sometimes say the people elected Trump, and they would try to correct her. She's lying. It's like, well, no, that's clearly coded and it's true. For those people, he was legitimate. Like, Obama wasn't legitimate because he, won re-election with 39% of the white vote. Like, he was stomped. And so if you're white, you're kind of like, who is this guy who's telling me what to do? Same with the Senate. I mean, even with Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia, these are people who won despite, oh, well, we got the 30% of the white vote. And so when you're in states where getting 30% of the white vote means you win, you're not, the white people are kind of looking around the other 70% of like, what's going on? They just don't like that. So you start to see more of the Jim Crow apartheid style laws. And that you really can't confront that again without confronting, again, the systemic racism. One final question for you, Jamie. I've been concerned about how the insurrectionists have been it seems to me as a non-legal observer that they're being prosecuted as if it was just a riot or mob or whatever, rather than this is it's not sort of like it's an organized movement to overthrow the United States government and to dismantle democracy, which is what happened and is ongoing. It's like clearly ongoing. And is there anything the Department of Justice to do, or liberals just sort of whining at Merrick Garland's not doing enough? Because the reason I ask this is because, to me, and I wrote about the lady who got the 60 days, when people getting 60 days, if they believe Trump is their God, like, to me, that doesn't break the mob. Okay, this Lowell Capo, you're going to do, it's like, I'll do 30 days on my head and go back and serve my boys, and they'll give me, it'll be like Goodfellas where they get fed in prison or whatever. It's like, that's to me nothing to dismantle, and I forget they're not getting after the heads of it. So like, what's your take on how this should be approached?
Yeah, and like honestly, like I haven't thought about it. I think it's like physically impossible for me to think of things like from a prosecutor's perspective. I don't think I have that. I don't think I'm able to think with that part of my brain. So I don't know like whether there is much that could be done, whether there's like an argument to try to use, creatively maybe use like a civil rights enforcement or something. It's possible, because I do know that like insurrection has a very specific definition in the federal legal world, and I'm also like not necessarily a person who wants there to be more criminal laws and longer jail time and whatnot. But what you said is absolutely true. If someone truly believes that they were doing the right thing and Trump really won the election, they will happily martyr themselves by going to jail for 60 days, 30 days with good behavior, and coming out with just reinforce, it's just going to reinforce their martyrdom to themselves, and kind of further entrench their beliefs, like Hitler getting his life sentence, or not life, light sentence very early on, just further entrenched that hatred. And I think that
those are the loyal soldiers, but it's just sort of, and obviously you're not the prosecutor. To me, it's like, how do maybe they are working to get, but to me, it's like it's Trump or the people close to him and whatever who
right,
those ones who are trying to pressure and overthrow an election, and kind of to me like.
Yeah, like we're acting like it was totally fine that we had a president encouraging this. And like if Trump runs and wins again in 2024, like he hasn't been disincentivized. Like I can see him saying, his first election first administration didn't count because of the Russia witch hunt, and so therefore, term limits don't apply to him.
Yeah, well, the fact that he's still and that he's viable and we have to fight this again is obviously dispiriting, but it's like he should be like in Elba or something like
right.
Like the idea that and then people were posting the day that November 7th when Biden was declared, and it's like, why are you celebrating that? Because what happened was a sitting president it was a terrifying period in history. And I know like some folks try to make jokes about it and talked about him as if he was having a tantrum, but like really, average Joes, a cousin of mine who passed away recently, but one of the last things I heard from him, like towards the end of, he's like a normal working class guy from South Carolina. He was terrified. It's like, what, you work in this, Stephen, what's going on? Like, what, is he just not going to leave? Like that was legitimate. You had the president of the United States saying, I reject this.
Yeah.
And everyone was kind of, there was either a sense of, oh, he's just having a tantrum, or like, oh, that's not fair, and that sort of stuff. And it just never connected to what an active threat he was doing that then escalated and led to bloodshed and violence. And of course, like the stuff of like, Democrats haven't tried to connect the fact that he might have deliberately sabotaged Afghanistan. Like he was making choices, like things of like the vaccines and certain things with COVID. It's like, well, we kind of have, it's not just about the guys coming in and meeting the president and whatever and shaking hands. The whole point of a transition is to not have some of this stuff occur. And he deliberately sabotaged it by like there's just no recognition of like the damage he was doing. And so now it's considered still a normal ex-president who could run again.
It's absolutely wild. We had an insurrection, we had an attempted coup, and Donald Trump encouraged and led it. And we are, there were like 5 minutes of outrage where everyone kind of came together and like kind of agreed that it was horrific. Everyone watched the coverage on January 6th, and it's like everyone else very quickly kind of just moved past that point and moved on. And now we're supposed to pretend that like it's politics as normal because so many Americans are just willing to delude themselves.
Yeah. it's like, well, maybe we can keep the guy who tried to overthrow the country, who's clearly lawless or whatever. Maybe we can keep him out again if Joe Biden passes enough good legislation. As if, to me, it's, we can't have a system where, because inherently our system of government is a power sharing system, and the party's going to share until the expectation is like there's still a nation when you wield power to the other side. And Republicans, each time they get power, make it harder to relinquish it until eventually there's a point where, Democrats just are sort of the Washington Generals, because no one kind of you don't want to take your kid to see the Globetrotters just play against nobody. That's no fun. So it only works if there's a patsy team. So, they will all want a marginalized second party, but it's an ineffective second party. And that's the dangerous thing that we're at.
Yeah. I won't go down my Supreme Court predictions and the end of our democracy, because I don't want to end this on a depressing note.
Yes, thank you. But thank you so much for coming in and joining us. And definitely, we should do this again, and either you and me, or you, me and Robin, or you and Robin if I'm away or something. But it was great.
Definitely, and maybe me and Robin can dress as Senators Cinema.
Yes, we were. That's what we were hoping for last week. So maybe that wasn't able to happen, unfortunately. But this time, sometime we should do that. That will be awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Honestly, it's hard for me to fully escape just kind of living my life, but
yes, there is a very cinema net, but you can kind of, you don't seem like distressed person on the subway. The look that she's doing is just kind of falling apart. All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.